Hello there, everybody. This is me, Ben Calder, here for the BTPA, the Bowen Therapy Professional Association. And wow, have we got a wonderful interview for you today. Really excited to bring you today's interview with Russell Sturges, who's the developer of Fascial Kinetics, one of the adaptations of Bowen Technique that was developed in the early 90s and it's been running now for 35 years. Now, Russell started very early on, age 15, at an apprenticeship with an osteopath doing osteopathic massage, and spent time then training as well in osteopathic and naturopathic methods, running his own practice for many, many years, but also then moving on as well and developing mindful mentoring, and especially his program, the Mindful Healer program, and teaching that throughout the US and through Australia. He's also the author of a number of books as well: Spiritual Roots of the Tarot, Get Out of Jail Card, and Metanoia as well, Renovating the House of Your Spirit. Now, Russell and I have a really, really beautiful discussion looking at the importance of self-awareness, mindfulness, and our own self-practices, and how that all relates into Bowen Technique. I'm sure you're absolutely going to love it. But just for the plug as well, make sure that you hit that subscribe button below for us as well, so you get notifications about our future interviews. And it helps our channel. It helps spread the word of Bowen as well around the world, so that more people can find this wonderful modality. But enough about that. Let's get on with the interview. Good morning, Russell, or good evening, Russell. It's here we are early on in the UK. I know it's a little bit different for you over there in Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today here for this interview.
My pleasure. It's a real delight to have been invited, and lovely opportunity to share a bit about who I am and my involvement in Bowen therapy, which has been fairly significant, as you are aware.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's really exciting for me as well. Like, and I have to confess, and I do apologize, but I hadn't really, in the, what am I now, coming up for 14 years of Bowen work, I hadn't really come across your work until I saw you in the documentary on Tom Bowen. And it's interesting how many names came up out of that I thought, I'm going to have to look more at this. And I was particularly impressed by your work. And, I know we're going to get into a lot of this as we go along today, but for those who are listening that have maybe not come across your work before or don't know a lot about you, give us a bit of an introduction about how you got to where you are now. What's the history with you and Bowen and bodywork and all the rest of the beautiful stuff you do?
Look, I was raised in a home where biochemical salts was part of my upbringing. If you got sick, mum would say, go and get Mag Foss out of it, and she'd have these containers of 1,000 tablets in there, and each container had, and so that was a big part of it. And we were seeing osteopaths and chiropractors from a very young age, which was we were a very different family in terms of those things. I mean, homemade bread. Mum made our own bread out of flour that they ground from wheat themselves, and my sandwiches would be, sliced apple with grated carrot, cheese, and sultanas. And, I would have done anything to have swapped for a white bread with Vegemite or Marmite, I think you call it in England, on it, but nobody wanted my sandwiches. And I expressed interest to an osteopath that I was going to, and our osteopathy in Australia is based on the English tradition, not on the American way of doing it. So it's very, very similar to English osteopathy. Anyway, this osteopath said, why don't you come and work during your school holidays? And so at the age of 15, I used to go and do a 12-hour day. I'd start at 6 in the morning and go to 6 at night. And I was doing massage all day long. He taught me how to do osteopathic massage. And I used to get paid 85 cents an hour. This is in 1973 that this was happening. And after the 2 years, and I'd finished high school, he suddenly said, you're gifted. He said, don't waste this, go and do something. So, bless my parents, because I lived in a rural country town in Queensland, which is a northeastern state. And the only osteopathic college that was sort of close to where I was relatively was Sydney, and that was 1,000 kilometres away. So my mum and dad left them at the age of 17. I went to Sydney by myself and went and studied natural therapies in Sydney, and it was quite eclectic in those days. It was very, very holistic. And but even by the time I'd finished the 2 years working with the osteopath, he'd taught me all of his manipulations. I probably could have opened my own osteopathic clinic at the age of 17 because of what he had taught me and knew. But anyway, so I went on, studied natural therapies, and long story short, opened up a clinical practice in rural Queensland, went back to my hometown, and was doing a lot of reflexology, massage therapy, and a lot of nutritional and homeopathy type stuff as part of my approach. And back in those days, it was still fairly liberal, and I was able to still do my manipulative work. I was taught osteopathic work at college, but I was using primarily what I'd been trained in doing when I was 15, 16. And then one of my suppliers of nutritional medicine contacted me. He said, look, I told this guy that I supplied to down in Victoria that I'd help get bums on seats in a workshop that he's just starting to teach. And this is in 1987. And he said, look, we're struggling to get bums on seats. He said, would you do me a favour and come down? And Clive Richards is somebody that I respect highly. And I said, absolutely, mate, come down. So I didn't know really what I was in for and what it was about. So I attended the second workshop that Osney Lane ever taught in Australia in 1987. And I was so connected to what was being taught and what was happening there. I went back and I completely changed my whole practice to doing Bowen therapy. And people left me hand over fist because they wanted massage therapy and all the things that I was interested in. Within 6 months, most of them were coming back. So I did that practice and hugely successful. I mean, when I sold my practice in the 90s, mid to late 90s, I had 5,500 clients in a town of 10,000 people, and I used to treat 125 people a week. And so hugely successful practice. But because I had done so well, Oz had originally suggested that I could become his first educator within his program. And at the same time, in 1987, my father died. And this all happened around the same time. And my mother gave me a copy of a book. Well, first of all, after my dad died, I had a series of dreams where he came and taught me about love in a language that hadn't been part of my religious upbringing. It was a very different approach to love. And Mum gave me a copy. She didn't know anything about it. She gave me a copy of a book by Jerry Jempolsky called Teach Only Love. And everything that was in this book was everything that I had been taught by my father in these dreams. And I thought, I went and bought every book of Jerry Jempolsky's, and I said, I've got to study with this guy. Next thing, he was in Brisbane, which is the capital city of the state I lived in, teaching at the relaxation centre there. And I was there that weekend, met him. He said, why don't you come to America and come and work in my centre and, do my programs over there and bring it back to Australia. And I said, Jerry, would love to, just don't have the financial resources to do it. But anyway, long story short, a letter turned up in the post saying, congratulations, you've won an all expenses paid trip to the United States. And my wife had put in a competition from a muffins packet, English muffins. And we won this, and that's how I ended up going. And part of it, I went to Washington, D.C., and while I was there, I was doing training with another lady in the same sort of genre of consciousness work, attitudinal healing was called. I thought I'd check out what was happening in the massage industry, very rare country. And I went to the Potomac Massage Training Institute, which turned out to be one of the biggest massage training colleges in the United States. And the lady, Catherine Hanson Spice, who's still a friend of mine, she said to me, we have so many people coming in selling their courses and what have you, and we just She said, but you just captured my interest. First of all, you're an Australian, and I was just taken by you. And so they decided that they wanted to have a look at what I was talking about. I thought I'd show them Bowen therapy. And there was this opportunity for me to do some teaching with Oz. That was the plan. Anyway, ended up having a conversation. They said, come back. We want you to teach this work here. So I then went down to West Palm Beach in Florida. The massage conference was on there. Talked to a whole lot of people there. Next thing, people in Florida wanted me to teach there. People in Seattle wanted me to teach. It just sort of went nuts within a matter of a week. It was the most amazing thing. And came back to Australia, met with Oz and Elaine, and they basically indicated that they weren't interested in me getting involved in teaching. And I said, well, this is the case of whether I do it with you or not. Or this is a case of I'll do it with you, but if not, I'm going to do it without. And so that's what I did. And so in 1989, I ended up going back to the United States and taught the first couple of classes. 1990, I started teaching, and then I literally was the first person to teach Bowen therapy in the United States. I was there before I was in Elaine teaching it. And so I ended up teaching it extensively. I used to do 6 weeks lecturing in a circuit around the United States, and then I'd come back home for 6 weeks. I had a locum in my practice, and I'd do my practice those for 6 weeks. Then I'd go back for another 6 weeks. And I spent nearly 6 months of the year for about 5 years lecturing throughout the United States, and trained probably several hundred people in that time throughout the US. Was very involved with the American Massage Therapy Association. I spoke extensively for the American Massage Therapy Association at their conferences. And I also, I think, was the first person to teach Bowen in New Zealand as well. So what I decided was that I wouldn't teach in Australia. I would leave that for Oz and Elaine. And so I didn't do any teaching in Australia. I just taught in New Zealand and in America. I originally called my work the Bowen system of body balancing, and there was a fair bit of flack from Tom's boys, including Oz, about the fact that I was using the word Bowen. And one of the things that happened while I was studying in the United States was that I was introduced to it's an osteopath. His name slips my mind at the moment. Leon Chowtow. His work and some of the deep tissue work that was being done there in that turn of that decade, 1989 and 1990. And they introduced me to fascia. And they said, you need to be looking at fascia. What you're doing is moving fascia. So I was told that in 1990. By 1992, I had become fully au fait with as much research as available at that time. And I changed my name for my program from the Bowen system of body balancing to Fascial Kinetics. And so literally, and Fascial Kinetics is being still taught today in Australia. And so basically Fascial Kinetics has been taught for, 35 years? Wow. Or thereabouts. And as you say, not many people in England know much about me and who I am and what I've done, simply because I sort of I chose not to make any effort in going in that particular area at the time. I was quite happy with what I was doing. Didn't want to spread myself more thin than what I was. 1996, stopped teaching overseas and decided to start teaching in Australia. As it turned out, it was very funny because one of Oz's state coordinators in South Australia came to a talk I was doing about my work to find out who this charlatan was, because she called me a charlatan. And she came to find out, and afterwards she said, can we meet tomorrow and have a coffee? Anyway, she became my first teacher of Fascial Kinetics in Australia, and she put me on to the couple who were the first teachers for Oz and Elaine in Western Australia, and they then became my teachers. They left Oz and got involved in my work. And that sort of brings me, that's the Bowen story in terms of the Bowen story. The other part of it was that the work that I did with Jerry Jampolsky, which was attitudinal healing, was also fundamental. And I became very involved in teaching his work as well and incorporating that. And for nearly 11 years at Dolby, I ran a free twice a month program on attitudinal healing for people interested in working on consciousness development and spiritual development. And that journey, of course, look, there's so much, but while I was studying at the Center for Attitudinal Healing in Washington, D.C., I was introduced to a book by, can't remember her name, Sally Nichol, her book on Jung and Tarot. And now I was very anti-tarot. I was raised a traditional Christian, and so tarot was the book of the devil, you know. Long story short, it totally impacted on me in such a profound way because it wasn't about divination. It was about the fact that there was a deep narrative for spiritual transformation in these cards, and particularly the major arcana. And it captured me, and I was into doing dream analysis and all sorts of stuff because of the Jungian involvement I'd done. And I had these amazing dreams that took me on a journey. Long story short, I decided to go and spend a year living in Italy while I researched the origins of the Marseille Tarot. And while I was there, wrote a book. And from that, in 2020, Inner Traditions, which is a big Simon & Schuster publishing company on spiritual topics, published my book, The Spiritual Roots of the Tarot, which is available. You can purchase it online. And for anyone who bothers to go and sort of look into that stuff, what you're going to find out is it's not the sort of tarot that you thought tarot was about. This takes it to another whole level. And now, in addition to the work where I work with people, teaching them about living mindfully and practicing mindfully, I also take people through what I would call a journey of transcendence. So this idea of spiritual evolution based on what was being taught. And essentially the tarot were portable stained glass windows for heretical Christians that had been basically genocided by the Catholic Church. And they took their teaching tools and put them into playing cards, and it became part of a game called Il Triumphi, which means the trumps or triumphs. And it was a very, very profound process of understanding of how to move from being totally invested in our suffering and our human experience into supreme happiness and our soul and spirit being. Yeah, quite interesting. So I'm a bit of a funny chap in the fact that I mix all these things together and yeah. But that's sort of how
I love it, Russell. You sound exactly like the kind of funny chap that I am in a lot of ways. In that blend of the personal development, the spiritual journey. You know, with the Qigong tradition that I work with, we work a lot with the I Ching and using that as a self-reflection, self-development tool as well. So kind of, although I was introduced as a teenager to a lot of that stuff from that divination point of view, I very quickly came to realize it was more about inner reflection and self-awareness and so on. So, you know, I really like that. And I love the fact that you felt it was important when you were teaching fascial kinetics that there was a degree of that self-development going on within the practitioners that you were teaching. So I'd really love you to elaborate more on why you felt that was important and how that had affected the way that you worked with clients and why you wanted to be able to teach that to your students.
Yeah, healing philosophy was a very, very intrinsic part of what we taught in Fascial Kinetics. And that was about helping people understand what the essence of healing was really all about. That it wasn't just about a technique. And you talked about, well, you know, what's the vision of healing now versus in the future? And my vision in the future is that people understand that healing isn't about a technique. Technique is just the medium that allows you to come and bring the art of healing to the people that you work with. The etymology of the word health and disease, I think, is a really, really important clue to this. And ultimately the word disease, this meaning not, and the word ease, shares the same root as the word next to or beside, which was adjacent, the Latin adjacent. And literally disease meant to be not next to or not beside, which is a state of separation.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand is that, in fact, every single person who walks through your door is dealing with some form of issue around separation.
Well,
That's now, at its core, it's about separation from infinite consciousness or source or God, whatever you want to call it. The ultimate disease is separation from God. And of course, where we get that idea is when we look at the word health, which shares the same root as the words holy and whole, and that's all about oneness. That's about to be one with God, in fact, is what that's about. So when we look at the etymology of the words health and disease, all of a sudden there's nothing, it's not about a technique. It's about a philosophical or a spiritual awakening from a place of separation to a place of oneness, So, Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, had a phenomenal tradition of teaching hesychasm, which was the mechanism of silence or stillness in order to bring about change. And they taught a 3-step process: purification, illumination, and unification. That was all about healing. And of course, one of the most important scriptures in the Christian tradition, in the New Testament, to me, was in Matthew 13, verse 15, and Jesus said, if you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and understand with your heart, and be converted, I will heal you. So what's seeing with your eyes and hearing with your ears? Awareness.
Yeah.
That's the art of awareness. Understanding with your heart, that's empathy. Comes through listening. So seeing, hearing, and by listening, I mean listening at a heart level. And what's the conversion? The conversion is to the place where healing happens in being, not in.
Yes, sir.
And I will heal you. And of course, in my spiritual tradition, the I is source will heal you, not Jesus. It's source. But so that became sort of fundamental. And so what I was teaching was, one of the simple things that I had people do, for example, students, as an activity. I'd say every time you have a client lie down on your table, I want you to imagine that there's a screen under the face hole and they can see everything going through your mind while you're doing the treatment. How many people would stay for the whole treatment? Because what happens is we lack that ability to stay present. Our mind gets involved, and you're familiar with what I'm talking about because of your own study and traditions around living mindfully and living with awareness. But basically what happens is all of a sudden, so the sorts of things that happen, well, here's what I can tell you, is that every single one of us become Bowen therapists primarily because we believe it's going to make us happy.
Sure. Yeah.
So the thing that drives everything that we do is the desire not to suffer.
Yeah.
We actually want happiness. We want fulfillment. And so, but what happens is every single one of us have gone through programming. And we have 2 core mechanisms of programming. So we have our 1 to 7-year-old program, which is very strongly mother related. And that's about learning how to be happy by playing the rules within the family. And then once we get beyond 7 and we get into our teenage years, we then learn the programming as it relates to society through the filter of our father or whoever's, these days it's all changed, but whoever is got that dominant social role in society. And so what happens is, by the time we're a teenager, we've been programmed with a set of beliefs that says, if I am compliant in a certain way, then you can be happy. If you have status, you'll be happy. If you have love and acceptance, you'll be happy. And if you have achievement and success, you'll be happy. And of course, this is where my stuff with the tarot comes in, because all of those things are depicted by the emperor is about compliance and the empress. The pope is about status. They were about triple tiara. Why would you have three crowns on a tiara? Because of status. And then you've got the lovers, which is about mother, girlfriend, and eros. And it's about the loves of the human love. And then you've got the chariot, which is the victor's chariot, which is success and achievement. These guys who were developing it, they understood that that's what drives us. And that's what's driving us as Bowen therapists. If you haven't done the work to really understand spiritual values, and what are spiritual values? Spiritual values are beauty. Spiritual values are inner peace. Spiritual values are love, unconditional love. Spiritual values is supreme happiness as a way of being or fulfillment. If you haven't got those things already in your consciousness and your being, you're looking for somewhere to find happiness. And of course, once again, what these guys in the tarot did a beautiful job of explaining in the Marseille Tarot. After you've got those four places where we all go to find happiness: compliance, status, acceptance, and achievement, three things make those things unsustainable: natural justice, getting old, and that's the justice card, the hermit card, getting old, and the wheel of fortune, good luck, bad luck. What happens is those three trump cards basically show that none of those things are sustainable. So as a health professional, as a healer, as a Bowen therapist, we go in and basically this is, if I can fix this person, be happy. And of course, what happens if you can't? How many people, I can tell you, the number of people who were giving up being healers because everything was based on fixing. The measure of success as a healer at the end of each session isn't how good your treatment was, it was how well you listened.
Beautiful, Russell. Wow. I mean, there's a part of me just almost in stunned silence, just taking that in. And I find it really interesting because it reflects something that I've said for a long time. You know, I've taught myself and mentored practitioners myself. And one of the things I've found for a very long time is that essentially the practice, the bit that we're doing is a ritual. And it's a ritual that allows transformation. And whether or not a practice is successful or not is down to whether or not the person receiving that is ready within that ritual for a transformation. And if we get the practice right, which for me comes right down to the moment I meet that client, the space that they're drawn into, so the environment that I'm with them in and how I relate to them, that's all part of the ritual. And if that is appropriate, then it allows a space for transformation, which the person is doing anyway. And yes, we've got these techniques, and yes, these techniques can be very useful, but actually it's the attitude of how we're applying and where we are within ourselves as we do it. And I love that image of the screen that the patient can see everything that's going through your mind, because it's so true. If you know, again, as an individual practitioner, for me, being centered, being grounded, being present with myself, being aware of my breath, you know, being aware of even the tensions in my body as I'm connecting, you know, these are all things that over the last 22 years I've you know, cut my teeth through and worked with and tried to understand how to optimize that space. But I love the fact that you're identifying that really we're only doing it for our own, you know, to a degree, our own gratification. It's if I feel better because I've helped you, then really, it's a selfish motive, but it is one that also serves the community.
Absolutely. And so, look, those sort of subtleties, and they're not subtle. They're actually, you have a discipline of bringing that. And that's what we were teaching. That's what we were teaching our students, was to bring that to the work that they were doing in terms of that. Unfortunately, it's a sad reflection. I've been very involved with the Natural Health Institute, who did the Tom Bowen movie and what have you, and I've spoken at those. And I've talked about the importance of mindfulness, and people get the message. I've hardly ever had anybody come on board and do any of the training, which to me is a sad reflection on our industry, on our work, that people aren't doing this. So become so fixated about technique and certification. One of the things that I actively went against in Australia was the fact that they were pursuing getting government certification for this work, in order for it to be approved and recognised. And I said, the minute you do that, we're going to shift from bringing the essence of heart, and who Tom Bowen was in many regards. We're going to lose that spirit of who he was in terms of what he brought to this. And we're going to become just like physiotherapists and everybody else. And it'll be a sausage machine where we're pumping people through. And unfortunately, it sort of went that way for a while, but in Australia, all that's been removed again. So that, people are still wanting to go there because they're needing somebody else to validate who they are. I didn't have 5,500 clients because somebody else, as in a government authority, validated me. It was because people told other people about who I was and what I did. This is a true story. 2 days ago, I had a man. I live in a mountain range in a rainforest, off grid. I'm not close. 60 kilometers is the closest town to where I am, and I live here for a choice. But I do see people if people want to come and see me. I had a guy come and see me on Monday who saw me in 1993, and he found me online.
Wow.
He and his wife drove 700 kilometers to come and have a treatment with me.
Wow.
That's nuts.
But it's beautiful because it really highlights how much the practitioner is more important. The person, the essence of who they're coming to see, it is greater than just finding your nearest practitioner. And, even last year, I published an article in Touch, which is the UK journal for the BTPA, all about the importance of having a self-practice, of actually knowing thyself. And that for me, Qigong is that vessel because it's asking me to pay attention to who I am and where I am and what I'm doing and how I behave so that I can assess and treat myself through that self-inquiry. And the importance of doing that, and it comes along the lines of, well, if I don't know myself, or if I'm limited in how I can relate to myself, then that also limits how I can relate to others. Because if I don't have that depth of understanding, how am I going to be able to relate to the breadth of possibilities that may show up in my treatment room?
Yeah. So, and then you get things like, sort of personality traits, which is the way, sort of the Enneagram, for example. If you bring the Enneagram, every Bowen therapist should know who they are on the Enneagram so that they understand what their triggers are and what their motives are for what they're doing, so that they're able to bring awareness to how because at the end of the day, the remedy is always awareness and being mindful. I don't care what you are on the Enneagram, you're still going to use the same tool in terms of how you practice, but you need to know what your starting position is. And so I don't teach Enneagram. One of the things that I do is help people identify their childhood narratives. The Franciscans had a saying, give me a boy until he is 7 and I'll give you the man. And basically what that's saying is so much of how we function in our adult world is being driven by our 7-year-old. I've got a lovely picture of an adult with at the end of puppet ropes, and the 7-year-old's got the control. And that's literal. If you haven't done the work, if you don't know what your childhood narrative is, I can tell you your 7-year-old is basically controlling you.
And that's so evident with so many people as well. It's that nature of that unconscious when it comes through, when they're not present with themselves. And you just see those automatic loops running. And it's those patterns that are making more decisions and orienting more direction than almost anything else within a person's life. And often is that reason why they're coming in, because there's something that, okay, it may show up in a pain, but it's all of the things that led to that point that have created that behavior and that issue.
And I think that if you're able to adopt consciousness as a way of being as a health professional, the biggest part of your healing isn't what you do, it's who you be. And in fact, people will have their healing. You know, in the Christian tradition, Jesus didn't have to perform technique for healing to happen. And I've been in that situation. One of the things that used to happen to me, Ben, is because I was present, you see, if you're not present, you won't hear. But I would often be given a word for a client, and I knew that I had to use that word. I wasn't looking for it. I'd be treating, all of a sudden this word would pop into my head and go, what? And I can remember one day this, a fair came in. I work on this lady, and I'm thinking, well, I'm going to use this word affair and she just burst into tears and talked about pain that she was dealing with through having had an affair. I could have done Bowen until the cows come home. Yeah. And she was in a safe place where there was no judgment, totally accepting and unconditional in the loving of who she was, and was able to hold her in that space and listen. Healing is listening, and to really have that be what I do. And these words would unlock the doors of what was going on in people's lives in really significant ways. Yeah.
And that's often what I've said when I've described Bowen to people, is that there's a process within there where my fingertips are that listening. And it's part of that feedback that's coming through them that, it's such a beautiful communication system anyway, in the fact that even how somebody comes into the room, their body language, the way that they move, where they, I'm always interested to see where people move the chair to that they sit down in. What angle do they put it in? Do they want to be closer to me? Do they want to be further away from me? The language is coming in. So there's all this sensory input before you even get anybody on the couch. But then as soon as you do and your hands are on there, there's this dialogue. And I like the Bowen approach in the fact that, to me, it feels like a proper conversation, in that where I'm doing a move, it's a question. And then it's a case of, now I'm going to listen to your response, and that's going to prompt whatever my next question is.
The other thing that is fundamental to the work that I do, and part of the healing philosophy, is having people understand the spiritual nature of fascia. Andrew Taylor Still said that fascia was the skin of the spirit. And I describe that it's the place of who we are as our soul spirit being touches who we are as a human being. And so what happens is, the more distant or disconnected we become from our soul spirit essence, the more glued fascia becomes. And we become locked within our human beingness. So one of the things that happens, and this is why, once again, people need to be aware of the much more profound impact of Bowen and what's doing, is that when you're releasing fascia, you're literally creating windows of opportunity for people to get in touch with their soul being. Now, what happens, and here's what happens with this, is that people come back and they say, first of all, anger or tears is, so getting in touch with emotions is a very, very sort of entry-level soul. People come back and they said, quit my job. I'm moving house. I've left my partner. And I'm going, what? 2 or 3 treatments. And because what's happened is they've been locked into a belief system where they are so removed from really listening to their spirit and soul essence that they have no idea what's going on. And so disease is that separation from our core spiritual essence, which is part of infinite consciousness anyway. And so all of a sudden, when you do a Bowen treatment, and you've got to realize you're actually opening a window where people can look at their soul being and spirit essence that they haven't seen for years in some cases. And they're going, what's going on? And all of a sudden, they start connecting with what's true for them. And they haven't been able to do it for decades. And so Bowen is profound. And so when I have a program called Pathways to Mindfulness, where I work with people, I have a short version, but the long version is really having people integrate mindfulness and awareness as a way of life. And I work with people for 10, 11 months working through that process. But they have Bowen, not for any treatment, but just for releasing fascia. So they will go through at least 6 Bowen treatments during that time where we're actually releasing the holding patterns in fascia just to open up that place where they can connect with their soul being and their spirit being.
Beautiful. It reminds me as well of a statement that I use within Qigong, which is that the body wears the shape the mind creates, and we become the thing we practice the most. So if we reflect back to the 7-year-old that's running the system, if we're not in touch with ourselves, then that mind shape that we're holding, it creates those body shapes, and we become that. And it's one of the things that we talk about in integral theory as well, the difference between the subjective and the objective, in that, I can't think about a thing without my body having a reflection within it as well, because there's no separation between those two things. Just in the same way that if I stub my toe or I bash my elbow, I'm going to create mind shapes around it as well. So we get this interesting process where that Bowen is opening that window, as you say, opening that possibility to see the self. And it interests me when you get the clients that come back and they say, yeah, I felt great for a couple of days. And then it was like, it's almost like there's a fear of what would happen if they opened into that shape that they've been given the possibility for, and they've got to pull back into the thing that's familiar because I know what that is and I know what I'm going to get from it.
And that's the point at which I then have the conversation with the client about that. So I'm doing their Bowen. While I'm doing their Bowen, I'm talking to them about, that very thing so that they understand what's going on now. Unfortunately, nobody's teaching this in Bowen education. Yet it's such a profound part, and I know that the German gentleman who's scientist that's done a lot of stuff on fascia,
Robert Schleich.
All of a sudden, I just heard just recently that Robert's talking about the soul connection as being accessed as a result of manipulating or changing fascia. And it's sort of like, okay, and look, and I'll blow my own trumpet a little bit. And that is, we've been teaching this stuff and aware of this stuff now for 30 years. And unfortunately, it's been falling on deaf ears and way ahead of its time. But it's happening now. And so in answer to your question, where are we going? If we don't go that way, we will get lost.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that's reassured me a little bit over the last almost 12 months that I've been doing these interviews now, and that notably Michael Nixon-Livy, Graham Pennington, Ron Phelan, Jihan Aden, who teaches over here in the UK, one of the things that they've all talked about is this importance of presence within the self, this importance of where you are when you're with that person. So there's, when I learned Bowen, very, very mechanistic in that sense. There was this, notice how tense you are, notice whether or not you're relaxed. But that was as deep as it got. And, at that point already having, what was I, probably 17, 18 years of Qigong practice in my body. It was a very different kind of experience for me, been kinesiologist for 10 years at that point. And so it was very different for me, but it's been reassuring to hear that there is this other awareness coming in, and there is, notably from those people that have been there kind of 20, 25, 30 years in practice, that it always comes back round to that. And it reminds me, even in martial arts, that, for a lot of training, it's like it's only after you get your black belt and you start to go into the deeper philosophical side of things that you really start to understand the practice. So I think maybe there's been, it's this old school thing that we're developing internally. It's in small groups, but I'm glad now that it's being spoken about much more, and it's reassuring to hear that in fascial kinetics, it's something that's been there, throughout.
Yeah.
So but that nature and mindfulness within there, and the value of just having that self-practice and that self-awareness and the difference that makes, amazing.
Yeah. And I'd like to think that Graham and Ron were both fueled from exposure to me over the years in terms of, there's some stories with them. We go back a long way.
Beautiful. So tell me a little bit more as well, because I noticed that one of the books that's in your collection is the Get Out of Jail Card, A Journey of Self-Worth. Tell me a little bit about how that kind of informs what it is that you do.
So it's kind of an autobiography to some extent, and I guess the essence of it is that when I was in practice, in spite of the fact that I was bringing some awareness to it, I still hadn't done any of that work on healing the wounded child, and I ended up being 143 kg. I don't know if you guys use kilograms.
We can work it out. It's good enough. Yeah.
I was basically a third bigger than what I am now. At that particular point, burnt out severely, and was in a very severe place of not being well. Even with the understanding that I had, and that's just about, I'm a slow learner in terms of applying principles of awareness, and the turning point for me was in 2011. I walked Camino de Santiago across northern Spain, and it was the motivation of walking the talk, in terms of, I talk to people about, sort of wellness and what have you, and I obviously wasn't well, and that was the inspiration for me and I spent 18 months preparing to go. So I just didn't get up and go. I actually walked kilometers every week in terms of preparing myself, and walked the Camino, and all of that became a major turning point in my own personal journey. And so the Get Out of Jail Card was about that transformative process, and basically showing to people, I've done this, I've walked this, I've been through the dark night of the soul. This has been an intrinsic part of my own spiritual journey. I've had to go to the place of surrender, and living where I live is part of that ongoing healing journey. I choose to live here. I have a partner. We don't live together. She lives 3 hours drive away from me, and we catch up each month and connect. But we're both serving in our work and doing our work in the world. But a big part of what I do is I live in stillness. I live in a rainforest that's hundreds of years old. It's one of the most ancient rainforests in Australia, and the Aboriginals, our Indigenous people, rate this as one of the high spiritual places, and energetically it's an amazing place. But So the book is about my journey, and it's about laying open so people can see what was involved in my transition. I can remember as a child reading a bit of prose that said, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I would rather one would walk with me and clearly show the way. And basically what that book was doing was saying, I've scraped the bottom of the barrel, divorced, bankrupt. I had it all. I had it all taken away. And the get out of jail card is awareness.
Yeah.
It's being aware. Yeah.
And that certainly for me prompts an interesting observation that I've had, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. And I reflect it for myself as well. You know, I think one of the reasons, like I initially trained as a school teacher, as a elementary school, primary school teacher, and it was not the right direction for me at that age. You know, at 22 years old, graduating university, expecting to teach, and nobody had picked up on the fact that I was dysgraphic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and they were expecting me to go into schools and teach. And I just went, no, hang on, that's going to be a really bad idea. You put me in a classroom full of kids, it's not going to turn out well. So that kind of really put me into what became my healing journey. And one of the things that I noticed in myself is that, like you say, it's this desire to alleviate suffering. It's looking for this happiness in myself. If I feel better because the world around me is better, you know, and I've contributed to that's a good thing. But one of the things I've noticed is that quite often people will begin their healing journey for themselves. So they start having their own treatments, they start their own practices, and then they get to a point where they seem to do this weird transition, and they'll go and train to be a therapist. And then what they do is they focus on just doing therapy for other people. And it seems like they almost arrest that process within themselves. And my thought on that is that they're getting to a point where they're getting to the really icky, sticky stuff. And it's kind of like, I'm not going to look at that. I'll just head off in a different direction. And actually, by working on other people, I'm telling myself that I'm still doing the work on myself.
Yes, that's right. I agree 100%. Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, you've got to be doing the work. That for those that are listening, I'm sorry that if you're not doing it, get off your ass and do it, because that's what it's about. You've got to be doing that. I know many of you, please, I don't wish to disregard what people are doing, but you know, by their fruits you shall know them. And I work with a lot of people who've been doing a lot of spiritual work who are still suffering. If you're suffering, if beauty, love, peace, and joy is not your experience, naturally, you don't even have to be disciplined. In fact, you can't be disciplined to do that. But if that's not happening, then I'm sorry, you've still got more serious work to do, because suffering disappears when you move into that place of true awareness.
Yeah.
Which results in beauty, peace, joy, and love. And so, you know, and of course, what are we doing? We're about helping to minimize other people's suffering.
Mm.
Well, it's kind of ironic to think that you're in your suffering and you're trying to help others. And that's what you were just talking about.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly for me, you know, because again, I've watched so many people within the healing fields who are either sick or become sick, and they get sick in the course of their work, and they seem to, you know, for some people, I see that as a continuous cycle. It's like they'll get sick, they'll take time out, they get themselves back to a level, they come back to work, and it just seems to be a cycle that they're in. But it also then for me, and you know, I'm going to risk. I'm going to put this as it comes into my head. I'm going to risk pissing on the Grail here, but it becomes this question of, well, what was going on with Tom? You know, as an individual. And, I mean, I can understand how in the space he was in the community he was in, maybe the direction and the option for that wasn't so easy to become aware of. But for him, we hear on a regular basis how, there was drinking involved there, the smoking and so on. And obviously his illness and how he declined. And it's the curiosity in me about how all that energy went into others, but, it was almost at the total denial of the self.
And I often speak about that, and I'm not. I regularly say one of Tom's greatest gifts to us was his own life, in terms of how he lived it, and helping us to become aware that we have to become self-loving while being in the place of loving other people. If we're not making self-loving choices, then in fact we're handicapping ourselves, but what we can do for other people as well. And so I think that that's a very valid and important observation. And if you listen to any of the talks that I've done with the Natural Health Institute, I've often made reference to that in those talks about that whole situation of Tom giving us the lesson of being self-loving. Once again, in the Christian tradition, Jesus said the greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the same as loving God. And so, fortunately, our Christian tradition sort of says that self-love is egoic. And yet there's a very, very profound, wonderful approach to self-love. And that's a big part of what I'm teaching, is teaching people to become more self-loving.
And it comes back to the point you made earlier as well about this idea that if the patient on the couch has got this screen that they can see inside of your thoughts, but at every moment that they're with you, your body language is communicating far, far more than you realize. And, from our point of view in Life Force Qigong, we talk about it being the accumulation of our karmas, the things that we've picked up through the journey in life. And so that comes through into how my body moves, how that feeling. So if I'm holding all of these clenched fists inside of myself, all this unresolved stuff, then that in itself affects the way I move. And I can even remember a colleague of mine who we studied with the same Chinese grandmaster for a while in a form of movement called Ili Chen. And he and I, he's in Australia, and he and I would send each other videos about bits that we were doing and, talk about them and ask each other questions and so on. And I can remember him doing this movement with his arm. And I asked him once, I said, so when our Sifu does that, his arm extends all the way out. Why doesn't yours? And he said, because I had an accident when I was much younger and my elbow's fused and it won't go beyond that point. And I was like, oh, right, do you ever tell any of your students that? And he stopped and he went, no, never thought about it. And it's kind of like, so none of them had been shown that actually that move extended out, but because of his own physical limitation as a teacher, that wasn't getting translated. And that really shows, I think, so often how with that lack of self-awareness, what we're transmitting, what's being passed over, and the effect that can have, that knock-on effect. Like you say, if we're aiming to alleviate suffering and we're wanting to try and bring more joy, more love, more beauty into the world, then we have to be aware of where we're stifling that, blocking that, resisting that ourselves as well.
Yeah, I just want to, you'll notice my face is quite red. And the reason that it's quite red was today I was going to treat a client actually, and on my motorbike, and it broke down going down the mountain. And I spent 5 hours sitting on my motorbike. I did have coverage, but once upon a time, I would have been angry. I would have been discombobulated, and completely out of my stillness. And I literally sat on my bike for 5 hours, and I was dealing with people in terms of getting arrangements for it to come, but it wasn't happening fast, and it didn't matter. I was able to sit, and unfortunately I did get a bit of reflection and got a bit of colour on my face. So that is a little bit of sunburn today from having sat for 5 hours on my motorbike. But it's about living it. It's about the fact that I could sit there and be in that place and be totally okay with being in that place. And what happens is that when you move into that within your work as a health professional, when awareness and mindfulness is what you've committed your life to being and the spiritual values. So when you've aligned yourself with those values as being a priority, then something quite profound gets involved in your world. It's always there, just that we cut it off, and that's grace. And one of the things that I can tell you is that more and more, as I step into that which is just aware and living in stillness with those values is what I prioritize, the amazing presence of grace in terms of abundance and that abundance is about success in my work, in my treatments, and it's success in everything that I experience in my life. And just being able to sit there today, be in that place, and you know, the total abundance of it was that the lady that I was going to go and treat. Well, I'll back up a little bit. Just before Christmas, I hit a dingo. Not many people hit dingoes. They hit kangaroos in Australia, but not dingoes. They hit a dingo and they wrote my car off. And so I had my motorbike, which is a scooter. It's a 650 scooter. It's a big scooter. And it broke down. It's sort of like, oh, I don't have a vehicle. And anyway, I phoned this lady to tell her the situation. And I said, and she said, well, if you can make your way to my place, she said, you can have my car because I don't need it at the moment. And as it turned out, the guy who came to pick me up was going past her place, was able to drop me off, and I had a car and I drove home, and I was here half an hour before our session tonight. And that's how grace works.
Yeah.
I wasn't sitting there worrying about where a car was going to come from. I wasn't sitting there getting angry because the motorbike wasn't doing what it was doing. I just sat in the place of stillness and was just present to being in that place, listening to the birds and watching nature. Yeah.
Which is a fabulous way to live life, because stuff's going to happen. You know, there's an American psychologist, Philip Stutz, and he says if we can get used to three ideas: the fact that there will be pain, there will be uncertainty, and there will be constant work. And I always like to add a fourth onto there, that there will be death in, you know, a certain way. That once we can accept all of that, life gets a lot easier, because we stop fearing these things and we stop resisting these things, and it allows us to be just much more present with what's taking place around us.
And I think the other one is that grace is real. You know, and if you don't know grace, you might have tastes of it from time to time, but you don't know grace if you're not in that place of beauty, peace, love, and joy as a way of being. And let me say, the more I immerse myself in that, the more I see the beauty of grace manifesting in my world. And I realize it always was just me. And as you said, the mind blocks it all out and stops it. And we only manifest what our mind can manifest. And I can tell you that grace is real, and that when you bring grace to your healing, people will beat a heart to your door. It's that simple. People want to know how to build their practices, practice with grace, and people will beat a path to your door.
Beautiful. I love that. So we've been going for just about an hour now, Russell, and I'm you know, I love how this has just flowed. I really, really love it. I'm curious to know where you think we should be doing more in Bowen and in bodywork, where you think we should be looking more, where we should be aiming over the next decade, the things that we're not focusing on enough. What would be your priorities within there?
Well, obviously, personal mindfulness is, I think that's absolutely essential. That's got to be paramount in that. And I think that in terms of Bowen, really, first of all, becoming intimately familiar with the nature of fascia. I think that if people can learn how to feel fascia, and that's what you were talking about earlier on, was that ability. Because what happens is, what we have is all these rules of Bowen. But when you start to listen to fascia, the rules go out the door, because fascia has its own agenda. And so then you have to start to be a little creative or intuitive. I love Rudolf Steiner says, when we move into that place of awareness, we have imagination, inspiration, and intuition. And I think that that's what we've got to be able to do, is to start to break away from the rigidity of these are the rules and you've got to stick to the rules. That's okay while you're learning. But once you start to feel fascia, and you can feel it changing, so when I do the BRMs on somebody, I go through the BRMs and I do the 2-minute weights. But once again, I'll only do a 2-minute weight if the fascia is glued. If the fascia is fluid, I might wait 30 seconds and go on and do the next. If the fascia is glued, I'll come back and repeat the move with more intensity of focus, not depth, but stretching, and then I'll let it wait for 5 minutes in that place. So in other words, we've got to become fluid and receptive for what's there, instead of taking a technique and trying to push people through a sausage skin that we call Bowen therapy. We've got to, and so I guess what I would love to see is more and more of people being able to understand the quality and nature of fascia, not just, the physical is so important, but also the fact that it's the skin of the spirit. That's where we need to be going over the next decade, is moving towards that.
Brilliant. And that really comes back to that importance of listening, of awareness, and was really nicely coined by Gusta Lacara, who's one of our teachers over here in the UK. And he said, be loyal to your client, not to your technique. And, and I think that kind of really emphasizes that beautifully, that it's that really paying attention to what's there in the room with you, rather than, again, the shape that you've got in your mind about what you think you ought to be doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that would be my sort of tuppence worth about where we go over the next decade.
Brilliant. Thank you, Russell. It's been an absolute delight to speak to you today. I really, really appreciate your time, especially after 5 hours in the sun today. So, and just for everybody listening, where are the best places, if people want to learn more about you, where's the best place to come and find you?
Go to my website, russellsturges.com.au, and you'll see all of my stuff there and what I do and the courses I do. So reach out to me if you want to have a chat with me. You can get on to me through the website there. You can book a Zoom, no charge, 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever, and we can have a chat. But yeah, just go to the website. That's by far the best place to go.
Brilliant. And we'll make sure there's links for that in the description for the video below, so that people will be able to find those nice and easily. And thank you from me, Ben Calder, for the BTPA, the Bowen Therapy Professional Association here in the UK. Also to everyone who's listening today as well, we really appreciate your time and attention. You know what to do. Hit the subscribe button below so you can hear more of these wonderful interviews. And we're going to continue bringing you these through 2025. Russell, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Ben. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Everybody take care. Thank you.